So today we are going to be talking about our first system that we find in humans, and that is going to be the digestive system. So I know I mentioned this before in your tissues note, but this is quite a long, extensive system. So what we're doing today, even though it is a longer note, is actually just going to be an overview of the digestive system. So this is just kind of scratching the surface. There's a lot to know about the digestive system. This is actually specialized for humans, so it's going to be your digestive system. But if you ever have a chance to study other animals' digestive systems, it's actually really fascinating. The whole main goal is still the same, but it's really interesting and unique to see the different adaptations that other animals have come up with to gain those nutrients. So it's a great chance to study that. Today, we're just going to be focusing on humans, though. So a little bit of vocabulary before we start. Some terms that I'm going to be using as we go through the video. I'm going to use the word ingestion. You might have heard of this before. It pretty much just means food goes in. So food enters the system. With ingestion, you are going to have physical and enzymatic breakdown that's going to begin. So you don't have to concern yourself too much with these terms right now. I am going to be talking about them throughout the video, but pretty much there's two ways to break down food: physically or chemically. So at the very beginning, when food enters your system, right away we start digesting it two different ways. Digestion, what does that actually mean? It means the breakdown of food. So there's two different ways that we can break down food: chemical. Chemical is also known as enzymatic, and then there's also the physical breakdown of food as well too. So ingestion, food enters your system. Digestion, we start breaking it down. Two more terms that I'm going to talk about is going to be the idea of absorption. This is that nutrients enter your circulatory system. So I'm going to mention this again later in the video, but one of the most confusing things for students is when food actually enters your mouth, it's not yet inside of your body. It's in your digestive system, but you still need to get it into your body to get the nutrients. You still need to get it into your blood system. So absorption is the nutrients traveling from your digestive system into your body, into your blood. Then they can be delivered to the tissues of the body as they're needed. The last thing we're going to talk about is going to be egestion. So like ingestion, but actually the exact opposite. So ingestion with an I means food goes in. Egestion with an E means food exits. So it's the elimination of waste. It's a removal of waste from the body. This is solid waste in terms of fecal matter. You really want to make sure that you get the waste out, because if you don't, it can block up the whole system and you can't have food be processed properly. So let's again talk about the two different types of digestion. I know I mentioned them before, but they're going to be a common theme throughout this whole process. And I want to make sure that you really understand the two types of digestion. First one is going to be mechanical. We also can call it physical. So you're going to see me use the terms physical and mechanical digestion interchangeably. That's actually physically your body breaking down food somehow into smaller portions. So chewing is one way you can do it. Tearing is another way. Grinding, mashing, mixing, any sort of actual physical manipulation of the food that your body's doing. The next is going to be chemical digestion. So chemical digestion is using chemicals to break that food down further. Those chemicals are called enzymes. So we call these enzymatic reactions, and it's going to help to improve the digestion of carbs, proteins, and lipids. So today we're going to be talking about the breakdown of three different, we call them macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. All three of these are required for your body for energy, and all three of these are broken down at different times in your digestive system. You're going to study these more in grade 11 biology and also in grade 12 biology. So we'll talk more about what they do for your body. Right now, we're just going to talk about how they're actually digested. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. You do have in your Google Docs a link to a diagram that looks just like this. Please make sure that you fill it out. So digestion can be complicated. We're going to focus on each area. It's going to be kind of like a ride. That's what I call it, as a ride. And we're going to go through each area in order. It's really important that you understand, though, what the organs look like and where they're located. So you need to make sure that you understand this diagram. This is a common diagram that might come up in tests and quizzes to make sure that you understand where everything is, because you need to know where everything is and how it's related to the other thing to truly understand digestion. All right, so as we start to talk about digestion, I'm going to talk about something that's called your gastrointestinal tract. So you might have heard of this before. It's often shortened to the GI tract. Essentially, it's this. So, I zoom out a little bit. Yeah, there we go. It's this tube here, and from the mouth down to the rectum is actually just one big long tube. That's your gastrointestinal tract. So we do separate them into different sections. We're going to talk about the esophagus. We're going to talk about the stomach. We're going to talk about the small and the large intestine. Really though, these are all connected and they're just separated by small sphincters that make sure that food doesn't back up. So your gastrointestinal tract is actually a tube within a tube, there's a direct link between organs. Your gastrointestinal tract is lined with skin cells. So technically, anything that enters into your body here, anything that enters into your gastrointestinal tract isn't yet absorbed by the body. So if something's sitting in your stomach or something sitting in your small intestine right here, it still then has to pass through those epithelial cells, those skin cells, to get into your blood to be carried to your cells. So just because you put something in your mouth, just because it enters into your small intestine, doesn't mean that it can actually be used by your body. It has to actually absorb into your body to be passed down to your cells. So technically, even though this is inside your body, any food in your gastrointestinal tract is outside of your body. Kind of hard to think about, right? So your GI tract, we're always going to follow in order. So we're actually going to go through each of these sections in order. We're going to start with the mouth. Then we're going to pass into the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and we're going to end with the rectum. So it is very important that you know these in order and know approximately what each of the organs look like. Often the organ, the look of the organ, the structure of the organ helps its function, what it does. We're also going to study accessory organs. Now, it's important to understand that these accessory organs actually aren't part of the GI tract, but they help. That's what the word accessory means, is it's a helper organ. So your salivary glands, your gallbladder, your liver, and your pancreas are all considered to be accessory organs. So as we kind of take our journey, our ride through the GI tract, we're going to talk about the different accessory organs and how they help each of these areas. So part one, digestion. So when food first goes into your mouth, you don't have anything broken down yet. So you first have to start with digestion. So part one of our journey is going to be, we're going to focus just on digestion, how the food is broken down. So where do we start? We start at the very top of the GI tract. So we're going to start in your mouth. This picture always kind of freaks people out, but if you were to take a little side slice out of your mouth, this is what it would look like. So you've got your teeth, you've got your tongue, and then these kind of yellow blobby things all here. Those are all salivary glands. So salivary glands is very important. I don't know, every time I say salivary, I always get extra saliva in my mouth. So salivary glands produce saliva. Saliva in your mouth actually is very important. It is key for digestion. So salivary glands release saliva, and saliva lubricates food so it can be swallowed. You actually can't swallow food if you don't have any saliva in your mouth. So if you eat a bunch of crackers and get a really dry mouth and then try to swallow more crackers, you just get like cracker crumbs flying out of your mouth. So you actually have to have saliva in order to be able to swallow food. Saliva is also important for taste. Taste is actually a chemical reaction. Taste is a chemical reaction that can only happen if the food is dissolved. So saliva allows food particles to dissolve. So if you didn't have saliva in your mouth, you actually wouldn't taste anything. Little fun facts about the mouth. On average, you produce 0.75 to 1.5 liters of saliva per day. So I'm going to gross you out a little bit. I want you to think about those like liter pop bottles, and then I want you to think about 1.5 of those. You fill each of those with spit every day. Kind of gross, but that's how important saliva is with digestion. Most of your saliva is water, and it's going to moisten the food into a ball. We call that ball bolus because in digestion, we have a term for everything. So let's say you put some food in your mouth and you're chewing and you're chewing and you're chewing, and eventually it gets into that kind of like really gross, mushy ball right before you're ready to swallow. We don't call that ball, we call that bolus. So that combination of food and saliva really broken down, that's called a bolus. So let's talk about the two types of digestion that are happening in your mouth. The first one, I'm going to start with the least obvious one, and you actually do have chemical digestion happening in your mouth. So saliva has an enzyme that's called amylase. So remember, an enzyme is just a chemical that helps you break down food. So within your saliva is not just water, you have amylase, and amylase helps you break down carbohydrates. So if you have saltines in your house, or you have a really plain cracker that's not really salted in your house, I want you to try to chew one. Go pause the video, go get a saltine right now. I'll wait. Hopefully you got a cracker. So I want you to chew that cracker over and over and over again in your mouth. I don't want you to swallow even when it starts to dissolve. That cracker is going to go from tasting savory to sweet in your mouth. Same thing works with a piece of bread. If you've ever had a piece of white bread, put it in your mouth, keep chewing it, and eventually it's going to start to taste sweet. That's because carbohydrates are made of sugar. So anytime you put anything bready, any sort of carbs into your mouth, the longer you chew it, the sweeter it tastes, because you're actually breaking those down chemically into bits of sugar in your mouth that you can then taste using saliva. So the first bit of digestion in the mouth is chemical digestion, and we're chemically breaking down carbs using saliva. The more obvious type of digestion in your mouth is the physical digestion. And remember, physical digestion is any physical breaking down of food. So your teeth are going through. So you have incisors for cutting, you have canines for tearing, you have premolars, those are for grinding, you have molars for crushing, and you have wisdom teeth to just be annoying. Or maybe you're like me, you don't have wisdom teeth anymore, I got mine taken out. So your teeth are all going to aid in physical digestion. Your tongue also aids in physical digestion. So think about what happens when you're chewing. Your tongue actually is combining with the food and the roof of your mouth. So it'll actually mix and mash the food with the saliva, and your tongue actually will tilt that food back and help you swallow when you're ready to swallow. So now we are out of the mouth and we're like going down the throat. So we have this beautiful little flap back here called the epiglottis. So if you were to take a camera and stick it down the back of your throat, this little flap here, this epiglottis is there. It's a flap of soft tissue that covers the entrance for the trachea. We haven't talked about the trachea yet, but the trachea leads into your lungs. We'll talk about that next video. So essentially you have a food tube and you have a tube for air. Two different tubes side by side. You want to make sure that food goes into the food tube and food doesn't go into the air tube, because if food goes into the air tube, that's not good for your lungs. So your epiglottis is a little flap that goes back and forth between the two tubes, and that's actually going to help you to make sure that you don't get food or saliva or water into your lungs. So if you've ever drank water really fast and you choke a little bit and cough, that is just your epiglottis failing you. And it means that your epiglottis didn't go over your trachea fast enough, and you might have got a little bit of air in your lungs and or a little bit of water in your lungs, and you're trying to cough it back up. Your mouth and your epiglottis are protecting your trachea, or your blah, blah, blah. We're going to try that again. Your mouth and your epiglottis are leading into your esophagus. So your esophagus connects your food, your mouth, and your stomach. Your esophagus is composed of smooth muscle. So you can kind of see the muscle, the esophagus down here. It looks like it's muscle. And then that air tube I was talking about, that trachea, is at the back here. We're going to talk about that next lesson. So you can see they're side by side. So this is all smooth muscle. That's actually really important because it's going to contract. So your esophagus is going to contract, and that's going to help to push food down into your stomach. So it's technically not gravity that's carrying food from your mouth to your stomach. It's technically contractions on your esophagus, and we call those contractions peristalsis. So think about it's like rhythmic squeezing going down, and you're actually going to see the food is going to slide down the esophagus. You might have felt this before. If you ever swallowed something and you feel like it's stuck in your esophagus, you feel it like a chip, right? If you've ever had a chip kind of stuck there and it feels almost painful and you can feel like a kind of painful contraction, that's actually peristalsis trying to work the food down. So it's actually peristalsis, muscular contractions, not gravity, that help you to swallow food and lead it into your stomach. This is what peristalsis would look like. So let's say you've got your food here. We would contract right on top of the food. That would push it down to here. At what point you relax, and then you contract again on top of the food. It's going to push it further down, and that bolus is going to eventually work its way down into the stomach. Now we lead into the stomach. Now the stomach is said to be a J-shaped sac. So you can actually see this does look like a little bit like a J. Wider at the top, more narrow at the bottom. And it starts with the esophagus. So the esophagus drops into the stomach here. It helps you to store food that you eat, and it also helps to break food down. So the stomach does two things. It stores food and it helps to aid in digestion. So let's look at the chemical digestion that happens in the stomach. So in your stomach, you have something that's called gastric juices. You might have heard of it as stomach acid as well too. So your gastric juices are made up of three main components. First thing is mucus. So you actually have mucus in your stomach. It helps to protect your stomach lining. What are you protecting it from? Hydrochloric acid. So that same hydrochloric acid that we studied in chemistry is present in your stomach, and it can actually do damage. It's got the same pH of about a car battery, so it could actually burn holes in skin. So you actually have your mucus lining your stomach to prevent it from hydrochloric acid. It can help to kill any harmful bacteria. So you have other defenses in your body to help to kill bacteria. You want to make sure you don't ingest bacteria, but this is kind of almost like the last line of defense. Drop it in a pit of hydrochloric acid, and it's going to hopefully kill most things that are in your food. In your gastric juices, you also have this enzyme called pepsin. So remember, an enzyme is a chemical that helps aid in digestion. Pepsin breaks down protein. So in the mouth, you are breaking down carbohydrates. In the stomach, you start to break down protein. Your stomach also has mechanical digestion in it as well too. This you're not going to feel, but what it actually does is it churns or it mixes food. So your stomach, if you look at the shape here, it almost kind of looks like a cement mixer on the back of a truck, and that's exactly how it works. So it actually will churn food and actually contract, and it'll actually cause food to be mechanically broken down before it exits into the small intestine. So remember, food coming in is a bolus. It's still kind of a liquidy solid. Food leaving the stomach actually has to be a total liquid. So we don't want to have any solids in the small intestine. We want to totally liquefy foods in the stomach before they can move on to the next step. Our next step is the small intestine. Fun fact about the small intestine, it's actually not very small. It's 7 meters in length. So I want you to picture a meter stick, right? So picture a meter stick on the ground, put 7 of those in a row, and that's how long approximately your small intestine is. So it's actually incredibly long. What makes it small is it's narrower than the large intestine. So it's only about 2.5 centimeters in length. It does a lot of things. If you had to pick one part of the digestive system that actually does the most, I would say it's a small intestine, because it does digestion in the first part. It actually, most food is digested here, and it absorbs at the second part, and most food is actually absorbed here. So most digestion and most absorption happens in the small intestine. So digestion happens at the beginning. We still have to break food down. And then once food is broken down at the end, or in the latter portions, that's when food is taken back up. Food entering the small intestine is known as chyme. It's a liquid. So essentially, when food exits the stomach and enters the small intestine, it has to be in a liquid form. That liquid form is called chyme. We actually have the small intestine being so long, it's broken down into 3 parts. So here you can see your 3 parts. The first part here is yellow. It's a little bit shorter. That's where most digestion happens. You can have it pronounced 2 different ways, duodenum or duodenum. I always say duodenum. You sometimes hear duodenum as well too. So in this yellow section, that's where most digestion is happening, and this is where the chyme is entering. Here in this purple section here, we have the jejunum. It is where most nutrient absorption happens. So yellow is where we're breaking food down. Purple here is where we're absorbing food. And then the ileum is the end section here. That's where you're absorbing B12 and bile salts. So you're not really absorbing food at this point. You're absorbing some nutrients, some bile salts, and really anything that's kind of left over. So let's talk about some of the chemical digestion that happens in the small intestine. So if you were actually going to look inside of your small intestine with a camera, it would look like this. This is actually the inside of someone's small intestine. So if you were going to touch it, it would actually feel like velvet. If you've ever felt velvet before, just a bunch of little finger-like projections, that's because every single one of these is a finger-like projection. So digestive enzymes line the cells of the small intestine and break down food into small particles. So within the small intestine, these are all lined with what we call them villi. Each villi contain digestive enzymes. So there is thousands and thousands of thousands of digestive enzymes being released into the small intestine. Some of the digestive enzymes are, we have sucrase, maltase, and lactase. They break down carbs. So we actually have 3 different enzymes to break down carbs in your small intestine. Peptidase is there to break down proteins. And then we have lipase that's there to break down fats. So remember how I said the small intestine does a lot of digestion? That's because it breaks down all 3 nutrients. It breaks down carbs, it breaks down proteins, and it breaks down fats. Remember, carbs started being broken down in the mouth. Proteins started being broken down in the stomach, and we actually haven't broken down fats at all yet. So all types of enzymes are present in the small intestine to help break down all 3 nutrients. Your small intestine also goes through mechanical digestion as well too. Again, you're not going to feel it, but peristalsis, the same peristalsis that happened in your esophagus, is also happening in your intestine. Here it's not necessarily just to move food though. Here it's actually, again, those contractions, and it's actually crushing and mixing food. It's helping to break it down mechanically. The pancreas is not part of the gastrointestinal tract. It is an example of our accessory organ. So we have our start of our small intestine here, our duodenum, and we've got our pancreas. It almost looks like a yellow leaf, I always think like, and it's coming off right at the very beginning of the small intestine. So what the pancreas actually does is it secretes those enzymes for digestion. So those enzymes that I listed before, a lot of them are secreted by the pancreas. It also releases hormones that help to regulate glucose. So the pancreas will release a hormone that's going to help to regulate glucose, which is your blood sugar level. So your pancreas helps to regulate your blood sugar levels. Another thing that the pancreas secretes, remember that food at the very beginning of the small intestine is coming from the stomach. The stomach is very acidic. We've just dumped a bunch of stomach acid into this chyme that's entering. That's not going to be good for my small intestine. So also what we're going to release is bicarbonate. So the pancreas is going to release bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a base. So if we remember from chemistry, bases help to neutralize acids. So we're releasing enzymes, we're releasing hormones to regulate blood sugar, and we're also releasing a base to help to neutralize that acid as we enter into our small intestine. So even though it's not part of the GI tract, it's a very, very, very important part of digestion. So the pancreas I mentioned before helps release a hormone that regulates blood sugar. The name of that hormone is insulin. So if you've ever heard of insulin before, individuals that are diabetic have a hard time producing or using insulin. So they'll actually inject themselves with insulin. If you are not diabetic, it means that your body is able to produce and use insulin properly, and you actually are regulating your own blood sugar. You have to be very careful though, because you can develop diabetes, which is a hard time regulating your blood sugar if you put too many spikes into your blood sugar. So if you do eat too much sugar throughout your lifetime, later on you could develop diabetes just because you've kind of stressed the insulin system, the pancreas system. You've increased so much sugar into your blood that it's hard for your body to regulate, and you might not be able to produce insulin as well. Another accessory organ in the GI tract is the liver. It is also attached to the small intestine. So again, it's not part of the GI tract, but it's going to help in digestion. It helps to remove and break down toxins. So any toxins that are in your system are actually filtered through the liver. It also is going to secrete bile. Bile is very important in order to aid for the breakdown of fat. So remember, fats haven't been broken down at all yet. So not only are there enzymes to help break down fat, but there's also bile Bile will help to surround fat, and that allows for a quicker breakdown. Your gallbladder, which is right down here. So your liver is this big kind of brown thing. It's very, very large, one of the larger organs in your body. Your gallbladder is a small green sac. So the liver is great at producing bile. The liver is not great at storing bile. There's nowhere within the liver to store bile. So what the gallbladder does is it's attached to the liver and it stores the bile. So the liver creates the bile, the gallbladder stores the bile, and the gallbladder is actually what's going to release the bile into the small intestine through this small bile duct here. So the bile duct is actually what's going to release the bile, and that's part of the gallbladder. If you eat too many fats, you can actually see an overproduction of bile and the bile emulsifying, and you can get this idea of gallstones. So what gallstones are is they're very painful, calcified versions of fat. So you eat too much fat, you get too much biles trying to emulsify, and a lot of it can actually become calcified, and you get these really painful stones that you have to pass. So again, it's really important to consider diet. This is a really great system to help to break down fats and carbs and proteins and sugar and all that stuff. But if you eat too much of one thing, it can put this whole system out of whack. So now we've talked about digestion. So now's a great time to pause the video and reflect on all the different stages of digestion. You started at your mouth and we ended at the small intestine. Doesn't mean that our journey is over though. All that means is all of our food has now been broken down. Now that it's been broken down, we want to look at absorbing it into our body. So our next part of our journey, we're going to be looking at absorption, how that food gets into the bloodstream. So the first part of absorption is the small intestine. Remember, it's the latter part of the small intestine. It's in that jejunum. So the small intestine, I showed you a picture before. This is another picture of the inside of the small intestine. And you can see all these long finger-like folds or tubes. I called them villi before. They're projecting from the small intestine. What they do is they help to increase surface area. So increased surface area is going to be a very important theme that we talk about throughout this unit. So rather than having just a straight, I have my ribbon still. Here we go. So rather than having just a straight small intestine, here the surface area helps determine how much food you can actually absorb. So you can only absorb as much food as you have space. So you're going to absorb food along this space here. If we give ourselves more space, so if we have small folds, you can actually see, let's try that again. So if you have a bunch of small folds, look at the amount of ribbon that we actually fit in this very small space. So we have this very small space and we have this much ribbon by introducing a bunch of small folds. So essentially villi is a bunch of epithelial cells folded up upon itself to increase surface area for absorption. We actually want to have even more surface area. So what we do is we add microvilli onto villi. So microvilli are small folds on top of your small folds. So you can see one large villi here, and then you can see a bunch of small folds on top of it. Those are microvilli, and they help to increase the surface area even more. So if we were to zoom in, our microvilli would look like this. And you can see, again, there are a bunch of finger-like projections on a finger-like projection. So how do these villi actually work? So if we were to look inside a villi, what we would see is we would see capillaries. So these capillaries, we're going to talk about them more when we get to the circulatory system, but they carry blood throughout the body. So since we have capillaries in here, food is able to transfer from the small intestine into the bloodstream, directly into the circulatory system, and then those nutrients can be carried to wherever might be needed throughout the body. So a little bit about how much villi add to surface area. So villi and microvilli help to increase the surface area of your small intestine by about 10 to 30 times. Now remember, your small intestine is actually about 7 meters long. It was already incredibly long, and now we've increased the surface area by about 10 to 30 times. The more surface area we have, the more efficient we are at absorption. These folds actually give the small intestine a surface area close to that of a tennis court. So if you actually picture a tennis court, that size is actually folded up into skin cells and inside your body. The reason that we're able to do this is because most villi are actually only one skin cell thick. So you want to have them only be 1 or 2 skin cells thick. The thinner they are, the easier food is able to actually transfer from them into the capillaries. Let's now talk about the large intestine. So the large intestine is part of the GI tract, and it also helps with absorption. So no digestion happens here, only absorption. It's only about 1.5 meters in length. So it is much smaller than the small intestine in terms of length. Why it's called the large intestine is because it's wider. So the small intestine was only 2.5 centimeters wide. This is actually much thicker. It's 7.6 centimeters in diameter. The part of the large intestine that's the largest is the colon, but you do have other sections of the large intestine as well too. Before we get too far, I want to point out this little tiny thing that sticks off your large intestine. Might have heard of it, the appendix. So the appendix also comes off of the large intestine as well too. So what does a large intestine do? It helps to absorb things. It mostly absorbs water. So you want to make sure that you have the water come out of your food and into your body. It also helps to absorb salts and minerals. So there's not really any food that's absorbed here. Most of the food is absorbed in the small intestine. The large intestine absorbs water, salt, and minerals. Nearly 8 liters of fluid enter the large intestine, and only 0.1 liters comes out. So again, I want you to think about liter pop bottles. Think of 8 of them. 8 of them enter your large intestine, and only 0.1 of them actually comes out as solid waste. So the large intestine actually does do a lot of work, and it does a lot of work absorbing water and other liquids. Your large intestine also contains bacteria that help to break down food. So you might have heard of the term probiotic before if you've seen those yogurts and they've got like the dancing happy stomach or whatever. Probiotics help to feed your bacteria. So you have good bacteria in your intestines that help to break down food we couldn't break down otherwise. You want to make sure that you keep those good bacteria happy. If you kill those good bacteria, you're going to have a hard time actually breaking down food. You also will get the further absorption of vitamin K, B12, and other vitamins. And again, the large intestine absorbs water. One of the last stops is the rectum. It's the lower 20 centimeters of the large intestine. So it's the very end, and it's where we store feces. So you don't constantly release feces, which is probably good. As food is broken down into feces, you store it until one convenient time when it's expelled. So it may take anywhere from 4 to 72 hours for undigested material to pass through the large intestine. So you don't eat something and then 20 minutes later it's out of your system. It takes anywhere from 4 to 72 hours for it to pass through the large intestine. Depends on the amount of food eaten and the type of food that's eaten. Okay, a little bit about digestive disorders. So these are kind of just interesting. You don't need to know them for the course, but I always like talking about what could go wrong. Again, fascinating to study as well too. Crohn's disease. You might have heard of Crohn's disease. This is again the inside of a small intestine for someone that has Crohn's disease. So it's an autoimmune disease and it's an inflammatory disorder. So inflammatory just means when something swells up. And what's actually swelling up in Crohn's disease is your intestines. So this is actually the inside of someone's intestines with Crohn's disease, and they're very, very, very swollen. They can also see ulcers or lacerations in their intestines. It can lead to rectal bleeding, weight loss, and fever. Crohn's disease is something that we actually don't know a lot about right now, but there are quite a few people that can have it. It is a manageable disease, but not treated, it can be quite debilitating. So we're doing a lot of research off of what actually causes the inflammation. Celiac disease is a little similar to Crohn's. So it's an actual allergic reaction. So it's an allergic reaction to gluten. Typically, when you get an allergic reaction, you get that swollen throat and you could go into anaphylactic shock. So not great, you stop breathing. In celiac disease, the allergic reaction isn't happening in your throat. It's actually happening in your intestines. So here we have normal villi and microvilli. Here we have swollen villi, and microvilli. So you can see here, very easy to absorb food. Here, not so easy to absorb food because everything is so swollen. So it's considered to be a malabsorptive disorder. Again, allergic reactions are fascinating because we don't really know what causes them. So it's your body kind of acting weird to something it shouldn't act weird to. So again, celiac disease is something we don't know a ton about right now, but we are doing a lot of research on. And the last thing I want to talk about is a hernia. You might have a parent that has a hernia. You might have had a hernia yourself. What it is it's an actual structural disorder. So it can be caused by several different things, but essentially what happens is part of the stomach is actually going to push up into the chest cavity. So your stomach is down here, and part of your stomach actually pushes into the chest cavity through the spot that normally occupies the esophagus. It's incredibly, incredibly painful. Some people have hernias because they have issues with muscle tissue. So your stomach is a muscle and your esophagus is a muscle. So sometimes if that muscle gets degraded, it'll push up. However, oftentimes hernias are caused by lifting, like lifting things that are too heavy. So you lift something that's too heavy, you strain a muscle that you don't mean to strain, like your stomach and your esophagus, and you can have this incredibly painful result. Sometimes hernias will heal themselves if they're mild, but oftentimes they require surgery to fix. That's our digestive system. So what I recommend is going through and actually creating a summary chart where you summarize the different parts of the GI tract, the different accessory organs, and what actually happens at each of those sections. Again, make sure that you've labeled your diagram. So right after this note, you're going to see a little link to a Google Doc. That's going to be a diagram where you can go through and actually fill in the diagram that we had earlier in the note. All right, we only have two systems left, respiratory and circulatory.